All right, it is right at 1 o'clock, and we're going to get started. Thank you, Dr. Bennett, for joining our team again to bring us a 3-hour call. But if I feel like maybe like a solid 1 hour and 45 minutes could convert to 3 hours of CE time. So, it rounds
it probably can. I mean, we can get through some of this pretty quick.
Okay, awesome. I think we have a couple more people popping on real quick. I have recorded this call, and then I'll also send you everyone that's with us today in person and online afterwards, like last time for that. So take it away, Dr. Bennett.
Names and license numbers, and I'll get that credit recorded.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're ready whenever you are, Dr. Bennett.
All right. Sounds good. I will go on ahead and share my screen. Okay. I can't see anybody. Can you let me know, Lisa? Can y'all see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Here is the it's a QR code that you can download the slides that I used today. Quite a few slides, so it's pretty hard even in person to print these out. So I do have the QR code there. Talking about completing the farm and ranch contract completely, this will count as your contract's requirement for your license. Again, a 3-hour class, we may or may not take up those 3 hours. If we don't, then we don't. What you're going to get out of this class, we're going to be talking about the Trek Farm and Ranch contract. The reason that we do that is because the TR contract is has more detail in it. There's more places to mess up. Plus, there is a paragraph in the Trek Farm and Ranch contract that is right at the end that is a brand new paragraph that I think, in my opinion, is a pretty strong paragraph that helps protect real estate agents. After this class, you're going to be able to understand the provisions associated with the farm and ranch contract, learn how to fill them out to keep your clients and yourself and your brokers out of trouble. So with that, we'll get going. Paragraph 1, the parties to the contract. Who are they? This one sounds easy. This is standard across all contracts. This one sounds easy, but we do have some weird stuff that goes on. For sellers, ask the exact name as it appears on the deed. You can pull the tax records if you need to, see who the county believes owns the property. My family owns farmland in West Texas out on the west side of Abilene, and we're in an active contract right now. The parties, you can go to the appraisal district to see who it is that owns that property. I can tell you that about 3-4 weeks ago, I got contacted by the title company saying, we need you to call in just to make sure that this is your property. Title companies on the eastern side of the state are seeing a big uptick in people trying to sell property that's not theirs. So you'll want to make sure and get the names exactly as it appears on the deed itself. For buyers, how do they want to take the property? If they go by Bill Jones, are you sure that that's not William? What about juniors? What about seniors? That those make a difference. Is it going to be in a business entity? That can be a huge, huge difference. Believe it or not, again, there's people out there that try and sell land that they don't own. And just like this picture, ultimately, you would hope that they would run into trouble along the way. Sometimes they don't put it in the MLS. Sometimes it's difficult to tell. Title companies usually are going to catch it along the way, but hopefully we hadn't gotten to the point where we put down escrow on some of these properties. So again, the names of the parties and who actually owns it does make a difference. Paragraph 2A, it includes the word counties. This is because ag property might be large and can stretch across county lines. The description here, the description matters. You're going to want meets and bounds. There is no such thing as a lot and block whenever it comes to farmland. We ran into this problem whenever my mother built a house. She financed part of that new home, because she was going to get free sunroom and free wood floors. With that financing, the lender was out of Colorado, and my mother had spent 32 years in farm service agency on the lending side. So she knew whenever you asked for legal description, she provided the meets and bounds. The title company had a very tough time. They wanted lot and block. There's no such thing whenever it comes to farmland as lot and block. It's out in the country. Now, I will show you, this is a legal description as it appears on the Mitchell County, Texas Appraisal District's website. This is for one of the properties that we own in West Texas. You can see Abstract 508, Block 27, TNP, Section 65, Northeast Quarter, West 138, 235 acres. That is not the legal description. That is an abbreviated version. This is not the meets and bounds. I called my mother and I asked her for one of the properties, give me one of the meets and bounds. I need to find it. Well, she had the old deed, so she pulled it up. This is actually a meets and bounds. It's extremely long. Now, I typed this out for this slide, but I would never even trust this as a meets and bounds. I just make a copy of the original and hand it over. I don't want to miss a period. I don't want to miss a capital N whenever maybe it should be a lowercase n. Don't want to miss a comma, a semicolon, anything. This is the meets and bounds for one of our properties. It's extremely long. If all of it does not fit in paragraph 2, then you can put it in paragraph 11, but let's face it, paragraph 11 is pretty short too. In that case, if all of it won't fit in paragraph 11, if all the meets and bounds won't fit there, you can put it on a separate piece of paper, label it Exhibit A, and then in the blank for paragraph 2, you can say, see attached Exhibit A. So again, you're going to want to get the legal descriptions if you're working with farm and ranch. If you don't have the meets and bounds, well, ask for the deed if you're the seller's agent. You can ask the title company. Maybe they'll be able to find the deed to get the meets and bounds. If all else fails, get a new survey. For the buyer's agent, ask for the deed or ask for a new survey. You have to know what you're buying and what you're selling. Huge problems can occur if you don't know exactly what it is that you're buying or selling. What if the descriptions don't meet the legal? Well, you can ask for the deed, ask the title company for a deed, or get a new survey. There's also times where we might only be selling part of a property. So you've got the survey for the whole thing, but you're only selling maybe a corner of it. Well, the best option is to get a new survey. Get a new survey, then that way everything's clean. Another option, it's not a great one, you could describe the property as best as you can, say 25 acres in the southwest corner of, and then give the meets and bounds, encompassing and give a description of what's being sold. But ultimately, you want to get a new survey because you want to know exactly what it is that has been sold. Improvements. This is in paragraph 2B. Farm and ranch improvements are separate from residential improvements. Farm and ranch improvements are permanently installed or built-in items. It says windmills, tanks, barns, fences, gates, sheds, outbuildings, corrals. These, don't just assume anything here. Weird things can happen, especially on farm and ranch properties. Whenever you're looking at what is permanently installed, what is built in other words, what is a fixture? Again, the contract lists out several things that you'll commonly find, but the Texas Supreme Court actually has a definition. You know, I can remember whenever I sold my first house, I had made some cornice boards, and I wanted to take them with me. Well, the real estate agent said, no, those are permanently installed. Well, no, I can just take them out and just take, I can unscrew the screws and take them down real quick, but they're permanently installed. And so it bothered me. What is permanently installed mean? Well, the Texas Supreme Court has a definition. The Supreme Court looks at several factors. First of all, the mode and sufficiency of annexation is what they refer to it. In other words, how much damage is going to be done if it is removed. The adaptation of the article. In other words, is it a custom fit, an unusual size? Is it particularly suited for that particular property? And then the intention of the party who attached the item. This is where it can get a little bit gray. What was your intention? Most of the time, we can say, yes, your intention was for it to be permanently installed. But don't assume things. Y'all know that y'all have seen times whenever sellers have gotten confused over what is a permanently installed fixture. It happens all the time. My cornice boards was an example. We've actually seen with farm and ranch transaction was complete and the seller dug up the cattle guards that prevent the cattle from walking down a roadway. You can drive across it, but the cattle can't get across. We've seen instances where sellers pulled those up thinking they're not permanently installed. Well, they fit that road. They were custom designed for that road. It's going to do a lot of damage whenever you pull it up. And we can probably say the intentions were for it to be permanent. It wasn't going to move, but then the seller decided to sell the property and now they want them. Cattle guards, are permanently installed. But don't assume anything whenever it comes to sellers or even whenever it comes to buyers. If you have a question, ask. There's gray areas. Go over these in depth with your seller. Whenever you're in doubt, make sure you ask. And if the seller wants something, even like a cattle guard, tell them, well, then get it off the property before we ever even list it. Y'all already know how to do that. Y'all do that in your sleep. Get it off the property if it's not going to stay with the property. Accessories, farm and ranch accessories. This is where you list items that are not permanently installed, but that will be sold with the property. So some things will stay. This gets even a little bit more gray. You can have pens, cattle pens, that look like they're permanently installed, but the ones on the left here, you can actually fold them up, hook them up to a pickup, and drive away with those cattle pens. The barn in the middle looks permanently installed, but it's actually not. You can move that barn around. Chicken coops that are on skids, they look permanently installed to some people, but they're not. So go over these, list out items that will stay. Those items that aren't going to stay, it's probably a good practice, again, just to get them off the property. Crops in the fields. This is a huge one. In extension, I work for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. I deal with a lot of landowners, and in particular, landowners that are renting land. They might be renting land because the landowner wants to keep the ag exemption. We want to make sure, pay attention here. The contract says the seller has the right to harvest all growing crops until the delivery of possession of the property. I ran into this whenever I was negotiating the contract for our land in West Texas. We have somebody that rents that property. They run cattle on it. Typically, they plant wheat in the rope for the cropland. Well, our closing date is actually June of 2026. Why did they need that long of a time period for a closing? Well, we found out they're waiting on 1031 money. So we didn't have a problem having it under contract for that long. But the part of the contract that I didn't like is that we would not enter into a new lease arrangement without first asking the buyer while we're under contract. Well, I've got a problem with that because I don't want to have to go to the buyer and continuously ask if we get extensions on this contract. Plus, we go year to year for our cash renter on the land. And so we usually renew every December. So I've got a problem. We went under contract and just 1 year will not suffice at this point because I want to keep that renter on the land because I don't want to lose my ag exemption if, say, the contract goes kaput, if we don't close. I don't want to lose my renter. So I had to get together and say, okay, how are we going to get it so that the renter, if we close, then if they've got crops growing out in the field, that they can still harvest those crops. Well, written lease agreement, I want to make sure and put it in there. If we close and there is a crop growing in the field, I need to extend it. I need to extend this lease even past the point that the seller has taken possession. So that's one of the things that I wanted to go in there and get it so that we had a couple of months. Generally, we're going to harvest in, say, July, harvest our wheat. So I wanted at least until August. They gave me until September. So that's 2 months after. I have no problem with that. That point was negotiable. List any exclusions. If delivery and possession of the property occurs in January, wheat's still growing in the field, they need to be going in the exclusions in 2E. That's where I put, see this lease arrangement that I had also attached. Whatever the seller is going to be taking with them should be inserted in E. The seller and the seller's agent tell the buyers what they're not going to get. Discuss these at the listing phase. Always discuss this with the seller. For the buyer, ask questions. Am I going to get the chicken coop? Am I going to get the portable barn out there? Ask questions. Paragraph 2F. This is reservations of oil, gas, mineral, wind, and etc. We will talk about wind in just a second, but this is where you can reserve your rights to say anything other than the surface. There's an addendum for reservations of oil, gas, and mineral rights. Use a TREC addendum for the reservation of these minerals, or get an oil and gas attorney to prepare an addendum for you. The seller can only reserve part of the mineral interest that they actually own, and only a landman or oil and gas attorney can fully determine what mineral interest a landowner has. Now, the part that we're selling in West Texas, we've already had landmen came out. We already know what percentage. My mother has the original deeds. We know what we own. We own half of the minerals of what we were selling. Now, minerals generally are going to include your oil, your gas, your salt, your sulfur, your uranium. They're not going to include water, sand, gravel, limestone, building stone, caliche, surface shale, near surface lignite, and iron. What about wind? The wind is kind of up for debate. Oklahoma has said you cannot reserve the wind. Texas, we don't have a ruling from the Supreme Court. This is why, especially with West Texas, with wind energy still a thing, sellers better off hiring an attorney here. And the TREC contract even advises the seller, consult an attorney before signing. TREC rules prohibit real estate brokers and sales agents from giving legal advice. Read this form carefully. This was taken directly from the addendum for the reservation of oil, gas, and other minerals. I can tell you, we got approached in November about this property that we own. We had been approached for the last couple of years. In November, I told the individual that, honestly, I don't think that there's a price that would be large enough to pry this land out of my cold, dead hands. I mean, my grandfather put it together. I don't think that I'm going to be I'm going to ever be selling it in my lifetime. The person, the individual asked if they could send a contract over. And sure enough, there is a price. There is a price that could pry it out of my cold, dead hands. In the 11th hour, after all the negotiations were done, I asked my real estate broker. I filled out this addendum, and I said I want to retain 100% of the minerals. Well, originally, the other side, the buyer said absolutely no, but let us talk about it. The buyer came back eventually and said, we'll let you retain half. Done deal. That's a done deal. 50% retained ownership. I agree with that 100%, because honestly, the price that they were offering, I told my mother, who is a partner in the partnership that owns the land, I said, in my opinion, the price they're offering, they have bought the minerals. But you know what? This is just icing on the cake. So I know how much we own. We own 50% of all the minerals underneath that surface. Now, if this land closes, I'll own 25%. But we're talking in terms of percentage. Again, you can only retain what you actually do own. You'll have to get some information from a landman or from potentially oil and gas attorney to find out what percentage you own. That can be expensive. That can take some time. I've had people approach me in Northeast Texas saying, I'd like to buy, say, 15 acres out, in right outside of DFW. I want to own 100% of the minerals after closing, and I don't want to spend more than $30,000. And I tell them, well, number one, you're never going to find a property for $30,000 for 15 acres right outside of DFW. And number two, finding property where you own 100% of the minerals is going to be very difficult, because those mineral estates are split up generation to generation. I will own 25% of the minerals eventually, because I'm an only child. So this partnership that owns them will ultimately come down to me someday. Now, I have 2 children. So my 25%, whenever I pass away, will be split 2 ways to my children. And then whenever they pass, be split amongst their children. So we often see mineral rights are just splintered over time. It is very, very difficult in Texas today to find property where you're going to own 100% of the minerals. Reservation does include the reasonable use for mining, drilling, exploring, operating, developing, or removing the oil and gas and minerals into the future. The TREC addendum has an option. Changes that were made to the contract, not this last time, but the time before, made the addendum flip its meaning. I'm going to show you. This is the addendum for the reservation of oil, gas, and other minerals. This was the red line that we had 2 times ago, not this last time with the contract, but 2 times ago. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because, again, it is completely different. The meaning is, let's read this from the standpoint of the seller does, and let's read the red line first. Seller does reserve and retain implied rights of ingress and egress. Now, after the red line, if you read, seller does waive the rights of ingress and egress. So they completely took this addendum and they flipped the meaning, completely flipped it, just based on the wording. Whenever I saw this, I made some calls and asked, why did they do that? I mean, it doesn't look like, why did they make this major change? And the only thing that I can come up with, and the only kind of snide comment that I've heard, is sometimes lawyers, they will make a change just to show that they are making changes. So be careful here. If you've used this addendum in the past, if you say seller does, Well, now the seller's waiving their right to ingress and egress. Why does this even matter? Why does who own the mineral rights even matter? Well, it comes down to the dominant and servant estates in Texas. The dominant estate is the mineral estate. So the surface serves the minerals. That means that if they want to drill, yes, they can use the surface. Now they'll have to pay the person who owns the surface money for some type of an easement. But yes, if they want the minerals, then absolutely the surface has to serve the mineral estate. The mineral owner has the implied right to access the land for drilling. It is subject to the principle, to the reasonable use principle, but it does not require an additional payment or permission. The mineral estate is the dominant estate. Good documentation here is important. Get a lawyer involved if you have a significant mineral estate that you're trying to either hold on to or you're conveying. Same thing with groundwater and surface water. Groundwater is water that's below the surface. It's underground. Surface water means just that. It's water on the surface. These are completely different. The Supreme Court of Texas has ruled that the groundwater estate is the dominant estate. Now, groundwater can be severed. So in other words, if we would have had an aquifer underneath our property in West Texas, I could have reserved all or a percentage of that groundwater. I've seen surface estates that have been severed, surface water. I'm going to show you one right here. This is a fishing shack in the DFW area. In fact, this fishing cottage is on a couple of ponds that were owned by Byron Nelson, the golfer who won 11 straight and then said, I'm done. I've earned enough money to buy my ranch. Well, this was part of the ranch that he bought. And this fishing shack was on one of these ponds. Now, the houses weren't there. The houses were built after Mr. Nelson passed away. And whenever they ended up selling off that ranch, well, these ponds were used for a hay field that was a half mile uphill from where this shack sits. In the contract, the water itself, the surface water, the rights to ownership were retained by the estate, by Mr. Nelson's estate. And in the contract, it stated that the buyer was responsible for maintaining the pump that was used to pump water up to the irrigation system for the hayfield. This was a bad deal for the buyer because it's very expensive. Pumps can get very, very expensive, and it cost a lot to pump water uphill a half mile. But this surface water was severed from the estate. Make no mistake, you can do it. I've seen it done. Anything in that contract is negotiable. Paragraph 3A, B, and C, sales price. This one, I'm sure that y'all don't have a problem with, but we're going through each paragraph. We'll just go through this one real quick. As you know, down payment goes in 3A. The loan amount goes in 3B, and the offer price is in 3C. And A plus B have to equal C. If you're paying cash, you got a cash buyer, they're not getting a loan, then the price you're offering goes in 3A, nothing goes in 3B, and the offer price goes in 3C, and still A plus B does equal C. Now, this is my very, very favorite paragraph in all the farm and ranch contract. In fact, it's my favorite paragraph of any contract. It's the adjustment to the sales price. It is 3D. Why on earth would the buyer want the sales price to be adjusted based on a survey? This paragraph says you have a list price and a list acreage. If the survey comes in any different, we're going to negotiate through this paragraph how the price will be adjusted based on that new survey. This could benefit the buyer and this could benefit the seller. If, say, for instance, the buyer, if the acreage comes in a little bit less, well, then the total offer will go down based on what's already negotiated. If it comes in a little more, if the survey's more than what's listed, then they will ultimately, the price will be adjusted up by the predetermined amount. Here's an example. Marty Bird entered into a farm and ranch contract with Walter White. Yep, that's Marty Bird from Ozark and Walter White from Breaking Bad. Marty's going to purchase 35 acres for $350,000, $70,000 down, $280 finance. Box 3D was checked to allow the sales price to adjust based on the new survey, and the adjusted price would be $10,000 per acre. New survey shows 34 acres, not 35. Under this contract, the sales price is adjusted down to $340,000. Down payment goes to $68,000. $272,000 would be financed. If they didn't have this contract, if they didn't have that paragraph, didn't have that for adjustments, then Marty would be stuck paying $350,000. What he would normally pay for 35 acres, he's going to pay that for 34. He's got some explaining to do. You may think, well, this is, this is not that big. Two stories here. Number one, saw a property that was being sold up near Wichita Falls. Seller did not know what they were selling. They were the grandchildren, had inherited the farm from their grandparents. It's like 500 acres. They get a real estate agent out of the Metroplex that doesn't know farm and ranch. They tell them, we want to sell the farm. Real estate agent checks the appraisal district, sees, yes, 500 acres. Check with the grandchildren. Well, that's what we always heard, 500 acres. So they list the property. Buyer knew what they were buying. Buyer did not use a contract. Buyer went to a lawyer to have the contract drawn up. Lawyer left out paragraph 3D on purpose. Buyer ended up getting 70 free acres. So huge problem there. Story number two, I can tell you, I was down at TR in Austin reviewing their farm and ranch contract, and over lunch, I asked about this paragraph 3D. Why is it not in the unimproved lot? Why is it not in that contract? Well, the answer was, well, unimproved lot, we know the size of it. It's inside the city. And I told them, you need to get out of Austin. Sometimes unimproved lot may be 3.5 plus or minus acres. It could be huge. It could be a lot of difference. Case in point, Brenham, Texas, lot downtown. The survey that they have that they're using for this lot was taken in the 1890s. The 1890s is when they're using the survey that they're using. Buyer knows for a fact that the acreage is less than what's on the survey. So how do they use a unimproved lot contract? Because it doesn't have this paragraph 3D. They need to be able to manipulate that sales price based on the survey. Now, yes, you can come up with some objections if you get the new survey. But again, if the seller says, no, I'm not going to bring the price down, who's paying for the survey? Seller probably doesn't want to. If buyer does and seller backs out because of the objections, well, then sellers just paid for, or buyers just paid for a survey that they don't even get the benefit of. Some sort of paragraph like this, if there's a question, maybe talk to some lawyers, see if they might be able to draft an addendum with similar wording if you're maybe using an unimproved lot contract. Again, my very favorite paragraph. We can take a break or we can keep going. I'm going to let y'all decide. We're at the point where we normally do. Do y'all need a short break or do y'all want to blow through this?
Keep going.
All right, keep going. We'll do it. All right, you got it. Paragraph 4, leases. Pretty extensive paragraph here. Check 4A if the seller indicates there's a residential lease on the property. Yes, you can have residential leases on farm and ranch properties. 4A is the one that includes that. That's where you check. Use the Trek addendum regarding residential leases. You can pull that in without a problem. Download and use that. Here is that residential lease addendum. Deliver copies of the residential leases prior to the contract being signed or within 3 days of the effective date. And everybody, I'm sure you know what the effective date is. It's the date the last party signs the contract and communicates to the other side that we have a deal. It's not just the signing, you communicate with the other side. That's the effective date. Let's say the buyer's the last one to sign, initial, give blood, promise their firstborn on Tuesday, September 24th. The buyer's agent communicates they've got a deal to the seller. The effective date is September the 24th. So whenever you're counting, the effective date is day 0. So effective date, day 0, September the 24th. Wednesday the 25th is day 1, 26th is day 2, 27th is day 3. Seller has to deliver copies of the lease to the buyer by Friday, September 27th. If the seller doesn't deliver these by the 3rd day, seller is in default. Buyer can say seller's in default and get out of the contract underneath paragraph 15. If delivered by the 3rd day, well, then within the paragraph, there is a comment after delivery, buyer may terminate within, and you negotiate the number of days after those leases had been collected. Also, within that residential lease addendum, sellers need to understand paragraph 3, except as described below in the seller's knowledge of each residential lease, the residential lease is in full force and effect. No tenant's in default. No tenant has prepaid rent. No tenant is enlisted to an offset against the rent. There's no outstanding tenant claims. There's no pending disputes. If there's a problem with any of those, get them resolved. Get them fixed. And it's probably not a bad idea to ask the seller beforehand if there is a residential lease, do any of these apply? If they do, get them solved even before you go under contract, even before you list. If something happens to be not true, you've got 7 days after notice to buyer to get them fixed. Buyer has 5 days to terminate the contract and get their earnest money back if you don't get these fixed. So, and this can extend closing up to 12 days. Y'all, this is probably old hat to y'all, but I want to make sure and stress it. Now coming back to the farm and ranch contract, we can cover natural resource leases, surface leases. This is in 4C and 4D. Realize, here's a change that was made. Natural resource leases and surface leases, paragraph 4C includes geothermal as well now for a natural resource lease. It's not just oil, gas, minerals. It's also geothermal. That was added. What is geothermal? Well, it's heat and steam and hot water below the surface. Texas Senate Bill 785 became law June 18, 2023. It says geothermal energy resources are considered real property. They're owned by the landowner or the surface estate owner if the surface and mineral estates are severed. So geothermal was added. Do not upload these leases directly to the MLS. There's private information on there. We don't want that to get out. A lot of landowners don't want everyone and anyone to know what they're leasing how much they're leasing their property for. This is not for public consumption. I knew that I had to get these together whenever, I mean, we didn't list our property. We were approached, but during the negotiation stage, during the time whenever we were ironing out the details of the actual contract, I was working behind the scenes to try and get these lease arrangements put together. Number one, we had a handshake deal with the guy that leases our property for crops and for for running livestock, which is never a good idea. And I could not believe we were working off of a handshake deal, but I wanted something in writing. So I'm working with the buyer, trying to negotiate how are we going to have things with the person that's leasing our property, and at the same time I'm making changes to this written lease. And I actually wrote the lease so that it expires June 30th of 2026. So if buyer comes up early, say in December of this year, wants to close, they know and they've agreed that a lease is in place until June of 2026. After that, I cannot guarantee anything for the person that leases our property, except for the fact that they have 2 months afterwards still to harvest any growing crops. But I had to get these together. They did not go into the MLS. They went directly to the buyer themselves. Surface leases. Paragraph 4D2. This is one that's a problem with me. It says seller provides buyer with notice of the following oral surface leases. Yes, in the contract, it does mention that there can be oral leases. My suggestion here, ask your seller, are there any oral leases on the property? If there are, get those in writing before you list. Go on and put those in, so that way you don't have to identify an oral lease. We have not had an oral lease go through the courts yet, as far as are they binding whenever property changes hands. It's best to go on and get those in writing. It really is. So then that way everything's black and white and there's no issues. Time frame. Deliver copy of the natural resource leases prior to the contract being signed or within 3 days of the effective date. After the delivery, you get to negotiate with the buyer how many days they have to review these leases and back out of the contract. If they're not delivered to the buyer can say the seller's in default. They can get out of the contract under paragraph 15. Get those lease docs early if you represent the seller. Ask about oral leases. They're all over the state. If you do have oral leases on property, get them in writing prior to even listing the property. Fixture leases. This is in 4B. If you're checking box for 4B for fixtures, don't upload these. These can be solar panels, propane tanks, water softeners, security systems. Attach an addendum. I'm going to say for fixture leases, ask questions. I was doing this presentation out in Tyler last year, and front of the association there, and one of the real estate agents mentioned that they had a property. They were representing the buyer. Property closes. Buyer goes. It wasn't a farm and ranch, but it was out in the country. Buyer goes, picks up the keys, walks through the front door, is excited to get outside onto the back deck so that they can watch the sun go down. Open up the back door, and the deck's gone. You can rent to own a deck in Tyler, Texas. And so that had a rent-to-own contract with it that was never disclosed. My mouth was on the floor. You mean they'll actually repo a deck? And I'm sitting there and I'm stunned by that one. And then someone mentioned in Tyler, Texas, you can actually rent to own an HVAC. You can actually rent to own an HVAC. So be careful there. Ask about everything whenever it comes to leases. Here's your addendum regarding fixture leases. There's the second part of it. Again, deliver the copies of these leases prior to the contract being signed or within 5 days of the effective date. Notice the difference here. Time frames are different whenever it comes to fixture leases. After the delivery, buyer can terminate within 7 days of the receipt of those leases if they so choose. But get them early. Get them very, very early. If not delivered, again, buyer can say seller's in default, get out of the contract underneath paragraph 15, get these lease docs extremely early from your client. Now, paragraph 5, earnest money, termination option, pretty much the same. Delivery of the earnest monies in paragraph 5, 5A. If you trying to decide how much earnest money is going to be put up, well, that's negotiable. It's determined by your parties. Who can be an escrow agent? That's come up before. Usually this is the title company. It could be an attorney. Don't use the closer's name here, though. Put the name of the title company because closers may move around. How do you decide which title company you're going to use? That's negotiable as well. 3-day period for depositing earnest money for the option fee. Well, you look at the effective date. Effective date is day 0. Let's say that the effective date of the contract, April the 7th. Well, April the 7th, day 0. The earnest money is due in 3 days. So the 7th, day 0, day 8th, day 1, the 9th, 2, the 10th is 3. Earnest money has to be in by April the 10th at midnight. If April the 10th maybe is a weekend or a holiday, it extends it one more day. So it'll go out one more day. And if let's say that your day 3 is on Sunday and then Monday's a holiday, well, it'll go to Tuesday. So again, I've seen some real estate agents that will sign after midnight, after 12:01. They'll sign at 12:01 a.m. So that gives them an extra day. When does the seller get the option fee? Basically, whenever they ask for it. If the seller doesn't ask, they're going to get it at closing. We haven't asked for any of our option fee money yet, and we've got it tiered based on time. And I can say that with your escrow money, I know that our contract states that our escrow money after so many days will become hard and non-refundable. That's what's in our contract. Problem is the title company, if I go and some of our escrow money is already hard and non-refundable. I could go and ask for that money. The problem is, before the title will release that money to me, they're going to get the buyer's permission to relinquish it to me, even though it states in the contract that it's hard and non-refundable. The title will not get in the middle of it. They will get a signature from buyer to say, yes, you can release it to them. If they back out of the contract, there is hard and non-refundable escrow money in escrow now that underneath the contract I would be entitled to. However, if buyer backs out, they're still going to have to sign that says, yes, you can give me, seller, my escrow money that's hard and non-refundable. We're backing out, but we agree to let them have it. That can be a bone of contention because seller cannot get it without buyer signing. Even with it in the contract, title will not relinquish it. They will not get in the middle of it. They will not assume. They're going to want buyer to sign separate paperwork. So, again, I tried to get around that. I tried to get it signed ahead of time, and title said, yeah, no way, we're not doing that. We will not do that. So there's really no way around having to get buyer to sign off that yes, seller can get their escrow money. Now the option fee is a different thing. Delivery of earnest money and option fee. Earnest and option are both delivered to the escrow agent. They could be delivered in one lump sum or two. If your buyer deposits earnest money and option fee in one lump sum and gets it wrong, they don't put in enough. Well, the contract says the escrow agent is to apply to the option first, earnest second. One lump sum that's short is going to mean that earnest money will not be paid in full. Buyer's going to be in default under the contract unless this amount is paid in full. Seller can terminate under the terms of paragraph 5. So double check your math here. The termination option. This is one that's big. Time is of the essence for this paragraph. Strict compliance with time for performance is required. This is one that even though this is in the contract, this is one thing. Time is of the essence. That settlement that NAR had is setting up buyers and sellers that choose to represent themselves to be in a load of trouble because time is of the essence. You're entering into a legal document with someone else. And if you miss a time frame, sorry, there's no going back on it. There's no option here to fix it. You have to know what you're doing. This is one of the biggest things. The time element is one of the biggest reasons you want to use a real estate agent. This is not the place to save money. If you don't get the earnest money in, if buyer doesn't get the earnest money in on time, is the contract terminated? No, it's not. Seller has the option to terminate. This part I hate. We just went over time is of the essence. Time is of the essence. In order for seller to terminate, seller's going to have to get Trek form 50-0 to buyer before buyer gets the earnest money in. Let's say that buyer is 30 days late and seller's been trying to get the termination notice to buyer, but buyer's been dodging getting that notice, just dodging it. The race is on. In other words, as George Jones says, the race is on. Buyer's trying to get over here and scrape together enough money for earnest and get it in, and buyers and sellers over here trying to serve buyer with termination notice. If buyer gets the earnest money in before seller can get that notice to him, seller can't back out. So time is of the essence, except here. I don't much care for this part. I think if buyer's late, seller ought to have the option. I don't care if you turned it in, 2 hours late. No, you're late. I don't like this part, but it is what it is. Paragraph 5B through E, termination option. If the buyer fails to timely deliver the option fee, well, the option period is not going to be created, and buyer has no right to terminate the contract. What happens if buyer fails to timely deliver the termination notice? Well, the buyer and seller negotiated an option period of X number of days. The option period expires, and if they don't deliver termination notice, buyer doesn't have the right to terminate under this paragraph. Time for the delivery of termination notice is 5 p.m. on the negotiated number of days after the effective date. It's 5 p.m. So this one, time is of the essence. Additional option fee. If additional option fee is put up, who does it get delivered to? Where does the additional option fee get delivered? Well, the Trek amendment says that buyer has paid seller. So payment must be made to the seller at the time of signing the amendment. Broker Lawyer Committee didn't recommend making any changes here where the option period for extensions are addressed. So buyer pays seller. 6A, the title policy. The blank line here tended to be the issuing insurance company. So it's going to be the title company. Again, not the name of the closer, name of the title company for 6A. This part, 6A6. Whenever I've talked to Trek, I've talked to the former chair of Trek, I've talked to the lead attorney at Trek, and I've asked about this part of the contract, 6A6. Everybody up in Trek has said, even right down to their lawyers, do not try to explain this to a client. This part of the contract, if you try and explain it to a client, you're going to be practicing law. Do not. Most title companies have a short little one-page handout on what this means, on what 6A6 means. But I've even complained and said, so you're going to be in a legal contract. You're going to be sitting down with seller, and you're going to say, I can't explain this part to you. Effectively, the lawyers high up with Trek have said that's absolutely right. Don't try it. Use a one-pager that's put together. A lot of your title companies do have these. 6B, the commitment. Looking at dates here, count the deadline. It says within 20 days after the title company receives a copy of the contract, seller shall furnish buyer a commitment of title insurance. Make sure the title sends the exception documents. Some send a link and it's all electronic and it's all easy. It's real quick. Some in the country, they still send the old paperwork. Make sure you find out how they're going to send it and make sure that it does get sent. Consequences for late delivery of these exception documents by title. Well, it says it right there in the contract. The time for delivery will be automatically extended up to 15 days or 3 days before the closing date, whichever is earlier. If the commitment and exception documents are not delivered within the time frame, buyer may terminate this contract and the earnest money will be refunded to buyer. So if the buyer never gets the docs, buyer can terminate. Does the title company deliver these exception documents? Absolutely, it does. It says in the contract that seller authorized title to deliver the commitment and exception documents to the buyer at the buyer's address that's shown in paragraph 21. Here is the 6C regarding the survey is the first place that we see a lot of the red lines that happened just this past time. Now, geothermal was added, absolutely, but here's your bigger changes. Some things to point out here regarding the survey. The red line of 6C1 says if the seller fails to timely provide both the existing survey and the affidavit of or declaration. If the existing survey or affidavit or declaration is not accepted by the title or buyer's lender, buyer shall obtain a new survey. Okay, so, if you've got your T47, you've got the existing survey, well, then the T47 and the existing survey says seller's going to timely provide it. If they don't, yes, buyer can get out. If the existing survey or the affidavit or declaration is not accepted after the seller has provided it, well, then the contract says buyer's going to get a new survey. The red line of 6C2 says buyer may not terminate if buyer fails to get a new survey. So if buyer doesn't get a new survey, sorry, you can't terminate on those grounds. Watch out. Look for copyright symbols as well. There's a lot going on with surveys saying, well, the survey is actually a copyrighted piece of material. It was done for that one transaction and only that one transaction, and it was provided to one person. Using it over and over again is an infringement on copyright law. We're going to have to see this go into court, but be careful here. And honestly, I can tell you, y'all have scared me enough with transactions. I would never go into a transaction and try and buy or sell a piece of property without having a current survey, one that I know was done, one that I even paid for. If I'm buying a piece of property, I don't want the seller's survey, especially if it's on ag property. I will gladly pay for it. Now, I would hope that you would negotiate for the seller to pay for it if I'm the buyer, but I will gladly do it even if I'm the buyer, because I want to know exactly what it is that I'm buying. Again, that T47 addendum, it's a residential property affidavit. I understand that. It's a notarized document, tells the buyer and seller that, hey, buyer, we know the boundaries. And here they are. It says you have the existing survey. Yes, it's a residential real property affidavit. I understand that. We could use that affidavit, that residential affidavit, for a larger farm, because we have the survey on a larger tract of land. It is a residential property affidavit. We're using it in farm and ranch. Why? Because it's required by the insurance industry. That's the only reason that I can tell you is it's required by the real estate or by the insurance industry. So we use it, both farm and ranch and residential use the same one. Why do you need the T47? Well, the buyer's the one that needs it. In fact, the buyer's lender needs it because it tells the lender and the title company can decide if they're going to accept the old survey or we need another one. This T47 has to be notarized to be valid. You cannot wait to be signed or notarized at the closing table either. If you cannot find your survey, don't worry about the T47 at all. You don't have a survey, never check choice one. My mother, whenever she sold her house in West Texas, she called one day and said, I found the survey. I found the survey. And I asked her, what's the date on the survey? Like 1957. And I said, Mother, you did not find the survey on that house. She said, no, I'm holding it. No, you did not find the survey, Mother. No, I'm looking at it. No, you did not find the survey. You're not going to use one from the 1950s and you're selling a house in 2019. You're not going to use that. So you just didn't find it. She would have never checked choice one. Objections, paragraph 6D. What goes in the blank here for objections? Whatever you think might be a little bit weird. We see weird stuff in farm and ranch. For example, seller doesn't want chickens on the property because of disease. This happens all the time. I'm not far from Denton, Texas, Denton County, where they raise a lot of high-end horses, race horses, cutting horses, things like that. And whenever I first got into the office in 1999, I was going around, traveling around, talking to a lot of the county extension agents, and we were driving Denton County, and we topped the hill, and there was a ranch there with a lot of dog houses. And I said, what's going on here? Well, they were fighting chickens that were being raised because Oklahoma, it was legal to fight chickens back in 1999. So there was a ranch in Denton, Texas that was raising fighting chickens right in the middle of all of these high-end horses. And the county extension agent said that is heartburn because those fighting chickens, they can carry disease that can kill horses. And so the person that sold that property did not restrict and say no chickens. So that's where I get that example. Seller could say, we don't want chickens on the property. Buyer can object, put in wording and say, hey, I object in 6D. Seller can say no. Well, then buyer can say, okay, I terminate based on the objection. What triggers the start of an objection period? Well, the buyer receives the commitment, the exception documents, and the survey, and they object to any part of it. If they object to any part of it, then it's back and forth. And that's whenever your objection period is started, is whenever they actually object. The cure period. The cure period starts whenever the seller receives the objections. They have 15 days to cure those issues. The closing date can be extended if necessary here. If the issue is not cured, buyer can terminate within 5 days. So, there's some issue on the property and buyer says, fix it. There's some issues that can be put in objections. Buyer says, I don't like this, get it fixed. Seller has 15 days to get it fixed, or buyer can get out. Or buyer can just say, I choose to waive my objections. I still want the property. If a new matter comes up, let's say that we've got an objection here and seller's working on getting that objection cured, and then we find a new objection. Well, we start a new cure period for the new objection. They can be running at the same time and have different end dates. That can happen. Exception documents. Pretty much anything that do y'all have anything to add as far as what y'all put here with the exception documents? Anything at all that y'all have ever that
I was just gonna say the people in the room that I'm with say no, but
yeah, you rarely see a lot here. All right. Easements. Easements is one that we need to talk about as well. I've actually got a whole hour class on easements, but we've got express easements. These are written. These are recorded. This is an express easement's the one that everybody wants. Utility easements, transmission lines, pipelines, road easements. You'll usually find these here. But then we've got some implied easements out there. These certain conditions have to be met, but they may not be in writing. An easement by necessity is one. It may not be in writing. Prior use easement, a prescriptive easement, an easement by estoppel. Again, I've got an hour class on this, but if you really, really want to look at it, here is a resource for you. There is about a 3 to 4 page paper that was written by our lawyer, and it's written in plain language where it goes over these different types of easements. And realize we can have landlocked property in Texas. It is a thing. It is a thing to have landlocked property in Texas, have no way to get to it. Also, adverse possession, yes, squatters' rights type thing. Yes, it can happen. There are strict hurdles to go over. Problem is that yes, sometimes with adverse possession, you could find it where your neighbor owns part of your property just because of they have met the legal standing. Again, if you want a resource, really read up about these easements. Right here is a link. And also, again, I've got a 1 hour class on easements as well. Paragraph 6F, surface leases. These could be written or oral. This would be your grazing lease, your farming lease, your hunting lease, cell tower leases. And you may be thinking, wait a minute, we covered that in paragraph 4. Yeah, we did. This contract is redundant. Here with 6F, it goes over leases again. Probably this is going to get fixed in the future, but right now they just have chosen we're not going to mess with it. We're going to leave 6F in. Title notices with 6G. Down here at the bottom, number 11 and 12 are where you see additions. These are brand new to your contract. Notice the changes here. Notice what we've got different here. Mold remediation's new. Be careful whenever you got the certificate of mold remediation for 11. The PID addendum, we've got down here with 12 required notices for water, utility, drainage, public improvement districts, Public improvement districts have been around since September of 2021. MUD, WCID, and PID were replaced. The reason that those were replaced, a MUD is a municipal utility district. That's a water district. A water control improvement district, well, that's a water district as well. So what they ultimately ended up realizing is we could include water districts, because the law states if you're in a water district, you're required to give notice. We can just say a water district and not have to put MUD, WCID. Public improvement district was replaced, the wording replaced PID. If you have interest on what these are, I do have a 2-hour class on what these different types of districts are and how we find notice. If you've got questions on it, by all means, do email me, give me a call. We can go over them if you've run into something on a transaction. 1 to 4 family residential contract. 1 to 4 deals with membership in a property owner association. The farm and ranch talks about an agricultural development district. I've gotten questions on those since 1999, whenever I started in the office. And what is an agricultural development district? It exists on paper. It would be a very poor choice to have your land in an agricultural development district. I've never seen one of them in Texas. The reason is if I put my property in an agricultural development district that says this property will forever and always, say, be raising cattle or maybe farming cotton. It will never do anything but raise cattle, or maybe it's going to be farm cotton, or maybe it's going to be farm wheat. It locks that property in regardless of ownership. Again, I've never seen an agricultural development district that's been active in Texas. Maybe there's one out there. I've never seen them. But if you happen to run across one of them and you're representing the buyer, I'd do some really, really deep digging to find out what can buyer do with this property, because chances are very, very slim. Water level fluctuations in 6G10. I thought this was kind of weird. The contract says, you know what, during drought, the water level fluctuates. During higher level, more rain, we get more water. So water level fluctuates. I've asked around, why do we have to notify people that the water level fluctuates? The comment that I got is the legislator sold property that they said was lakefront property, waterfront property. Well, drought occurred, water pulled back so that it was beyond the property line. Now the property is not waterfront property, and the legislator got sued. So now we have to tell people that, you know what, during drought, water levels pull back. That's why this paragraph exists. Do we need a break now, or do we keep on going? I've got an idea. I'm going to keep on going, and if y'all need a break, feel free to take one. I don't. How about
Perfect.
that?
We're good with
Sound good?
continuing.
And y'all
Yes.
just take, but y'all, it's not like, I mean, I can't really see y'all, so it's not like you couldn't anyway, but that's the way that I run every other class. If you need to take a phone call or you need to take a break, you have to take the phone calls is one of my policies, because that's money in your pocket, but just take the break and I'll just keep on going. 7A through C, the property condition. Paragraph 7A says utilities need to stay on for your inspections. There's a separate addendum needed for hydrostatic testing. That's your pressure testing of your pipes, your gas cylinders, your boiler components. 7B, to reduce risk, get the seller's disclosure delivered with or before the contract's being executed. This is one that's kind of funny to me. The seller's disclosure is in the contract itself. That does not make sense to me. And believe it or not, whenever buyer submitted a contract to us, the buyer had completed the seller's disclosure. Well, that's not right. The buyer cannot complete the seller's disclosure. That is on me, the seller, to complete, not the buyer. I don't know why it's in the farm and ranch contract, but you see it a lot of times where buyer fills out that seller's disclosure. Acceptance of the property condition. Paragraph 7D. Make sure one box is going to be checked. Does the buyer accept the property as is, or does the buyer accept the property that seller at seller's expense shall complete the specific repairs? What goes in D? Whatever there's a problem with. Let's say that you find out through the inspection, let's say you find out that maybe the well pump is busted. Well, you know what, seller? I need you to get that fixed before I take ownership. Seller indicates in the disclosures placements again that the well pump's not working. Buyer says get it fixed before I take ownership. Completion of repairs. This is one that I can tell you a lot of people in the country are going to have problems with. Right there, paragraph 7F says, unless otherwise agreed in writing, neither party is obligated to pay for a lender required repairs, which includes treatment for wood destroying insects. If the parties do not agree to pay for the lender required repairs or treatments, this contract will terminate. So in other words, if the lender requires a repair, buyer can say no, seller can say no, and the contract terminates. The one that I was thinking about that I'm going to see a problem with is 7E, as far as repairs and treatments. If seller's going to make repairs, they have to get someone that's either licensed to commercially has a license to do it, or is in the business of doing it. Case in point, I grew up on a farm and ranch. I replaced 3 different hot water heaters while I was growing up. The first one, I had help. The other 2 hot water heaters, I did on my own. I didn't have any help, and I was a teenager. Well, I go to sell my first house, and the night we were under contract, and then I turned on the water tap, and it was red. And I thought, oh no, I know what this means. Hot water heater is rusting out. It's about to go. So I don't know. I was talking to my real estate agent. We're under contract, and I talked to her and said, hey, I'm going to go on and replace this hot water heater. You know, it's rusting out, and I just wanted to let you know. And she said, you're going to get somebody to make that repair. And I said, why? I can do it. I can do it. I've replaced 3 of them in my life. She said, not this time, you're not. You're going to get somebody, because if something goes wrong, you want to have, we had a licensed plumber that came out and replaced this hot water heater. So, you know, this is one that's going to have some heartache in the country because we're used to doing things on our own. 7G, environmental warnings. What environmental hazards have you seen? Keep in mind, all assessments in the TREC environmental assessments threatened and endangered species and wetlands addendum says at the buyer's expense. Buyers advised that the presence of wetlands, toxic substances, including asbestos and waste or other environmental hazards, or presence or threatened and endangered species or its habitat may affect buyer's intended use of the property. If buyers concerned about these matters, an addendum promulgated by TREC or required by parties should be used. It's at the buyer's expense. Seller's disclosure, 7H. Again, I don't know why it's in the contract. In my opinion, I think it ought to be outside the contract. I ought to fill this out as a seller if I'm listing the property. Whenever we got our contract, the buyer had already filled this in. Well, guess what? We've got a creek that runs through the middle of our property. I know that part of my property is partially located in a floodplain, and they check is not aware. Well, I am aware. So I don't know why they have this as part of the contract, but it is. I think it ought to be an addendum, personally. Why did Trek add 3 and 4 about environmental hazards or a dump site? Right here on the seller's disclosure. 3, seller is or is not aware of any environmental hazards. Seller is or is not aware of any dump site or landfill. Why did they add that? Because stuff gets buried. I know where stuff is buried out on our property because I'm the one that was told whenever I was a young teenager to dig the hole. I know where the old iron is. My children do not. If that property would have sat through my lifetime and never been sold, and my children would have been selling it after I passed away and they inherited it, they would not know where anything's buried. I do. I know where the old hot water heaters are. I know where the old plows are that were used by mules. I know where those are buried. This somewhat covers the buyer from having to pay 7G, the environmental assessment threatened and endangered species. Remember, the seller's disclosure asked, are you aware? Yes or no? Well, I'm not aware of anything buried out there, but who knows? It could be. It's a big piece of land. How does the buyer's representative know what to do here? As far as the seller's disclosure, you don't fill it out. That's for the seller to fill out. So yes, if you submit a contract, you should expect seller to get that disclosure back to you, and then have your buyer initial it, and then get that seller's disclosure prior to having that executable contract. In practice, a lot of times you see buyers fill it out and sellers initial that, yep, you know what, we agree here. Here's the residential service contract. It's a home warranty company, is optional. And the choice of which one is up to the buyer. The buyer gets to decide, just like in residential contracts. How much do you put in the blank? Generally, you're going to find out how much is a home warranty. You're going to put that in. The buyer can use up to that amount. Government programs. Agricultural land has government programs that can be associated with them. We're talking about conservation reserve program, where the federal government is leasing out part of the property from us. We're taking it out of production, putting it back into native grassland, and the government's going to pay us a lease on that. And these leases can be, say, 10 years old. We've got farm and ranch lands conservation programs, EQIP, environmental quality incentive program. We've got all different kinds of government programs that can be tied to a property. If I buy that property, let's say that I buy property, it's got a 10-year CRP, Conservation Reserve Program lease on it. I buy the property in year 8 of that lease, and I plow under all of the grassland. I've broken that lease. The federal government can come back on me, the current owner that plowed it up, and get all of the payments from then till the end of the lease from me, as well as all the previous payments I would have to pay them back, plus penalty, plus interest. So finding out what government programs are on land, very, very, very important. How do you do that? Well, you can talk to the United States Department of Agriculture Farm Service Agency, FSA. Every single county has one. Again, USDA, FSA, Farm Service Agency. They will have a list of properties. They can help you out if your seller doesn't know, but you do want to put those down on there. Brokers and sales agent, paragraph 8. If you're a broker or sales agent and you're buying property, or if you own 10% or more equity in that you're acting as the buyer or the seller, or if your spouse, parent, or child is buying or selling property, you have to disclose it here. You have to disclose that, yes, you are an agent. Closing, pretty simple. Paragraph 9. Determine what's a reasonable closing date. Well, that's worked out between both sides. Who determines what good funds are? That's the title company. A wire transfer, cashier's check, rarely cash. Rarely you're going to see cash or a personal check. I can tell you horror story here. Real estate agent back during COVID they had a contract. They were representing the buyer. Real estate agent's email gets hacked. Hacker goes in, sees all the emails back and forth with buyer, and the hacker sends an email from the real estate agent's email address giving them wiring instructions. Nearly $700,000 goes through a wire to giving the wiring instructions, and it was bogus. Money was gone. The bad thing was the buyer was a VP of a large bank in Dallas. So it can happen. It can happen. I don't really trust a lot of wiring instructions. So for me, if you're my real estate agent, I would want to probably go to the title company and sit there and enter it in to make sure that it went and make sure that they got it. And I would be talking to them at least on the phone. Good funds, usually your title company is the one that's going to determine what good funds are. They're going to be the ones sending the wiring instructions. Just be careful of that because there are scams out there I'm sure you're aware of. Possession. Anything longer than 90 days. Let's say I'm the buyer and I buy property and then I lease it back to the seller. You don't want to go past 90 days. That's a huge problem, can create a huge liability risk for your buyer. You don't want to go past that date. So if the seller needs that much longer, maybe they end up negotiating that with the buyer to extend the closing. Smart devices. This section 10B, describes what they are. Get them off the property. All access to the devices need to be terminated by the seller. But I don't trust wiring instructions. So I can tell you, if you left a smart device on the property, I wouldn't know how to determine, do you have access to it or not still? So I would probably take them down if I were the buyer. Seller, you have to terminate your services, provide proof of that termination, or just remove the smart devices altogether. Special provisions. If you put language here in paragraph 11, it could throw a red flag up. Generally, best strategy here, use some 1031 language if you need to. It's always best to check and see, is there an existing addendum first? If there's an existing addendum, go on and fill that out and don't worry about putting anything in special provisions. Settlement and other expenses, no different than what you see, paragraph 12, no different than what you normally see with your other ones. Be careful here though. 12A, this one's new. 12A is new. If you don't fill that out properly, you could double obligate the seller to pay the other broker. So y'all have gone through that as far as, this is coming out from the NAR settlement. Sure, your broker's gone over it with you as far as how you're going to fill out it and how both sides are going to get paid. Rollback taxes. This is one that's different for farm and ranch. Paragraph 13. This is a big one. If you're engaged in agriculture and you sell the property, and the next buyer does not continue engaging in agricultural use activities, there can be a rollback tax. The rollback tax can be expensive. You take the difference between what you would have paid market value property taxes. subtract off what you actually did pay property taxes at ag value. You take that difference for the last 3 years. So it can get very expensive here. It can get very expensive. The owner who changes the use is the one that's responsible for paying the rollback taxes. That's what it states in the contract, is whoever changes use is going to be required to pay the rollback taxes. Now that is negotiable. Best practices here, always ask your client if they're the buyer, what's going to be your intended use? Recommend them talking to the Central Appraisal District before they purchase the property, or at least during the option period. Make sure. I was going back and forth with an email just this past Friday with a real estate agent, and their client is moving into Northeast Texas, and they have exotics. Well, I need to know what exotics are. What are you calling an exotic? I'm not going to make the call as to whether or not, what they think is an exotic will work for the Central Appraisal District. No, we need to define what it is, and you need to call the Central Appraisal District before you purchase that land. A $2.7 million property, I'd want to find out, are you going to consider these exotics? Some counties might, some counties may not. Buyer can change their mind about the type of property they want, or the intention of use. Yes, after talking to the appraisal district, your buyer may say, well, I don't want to buy that property then. Okay, it's better to know beforehand. Who pays the rollback tax is negotiable. It says in the contract, if seller agrees to pay the rollback tax, you better have an exhibit by a lawyer. It says whoever changes use is the one responsible. Well, if you're going to do anything any different than that, get a lawyer to write it up. Case in point, I was sitting in an appraisal district's office in Northeast Texas. Gentleman came in irate. I'm sitting there, I'm watching. The ag appraiser comes in. The gentleman describes that he had 70 acres in the county. The gentleman, it was ag exempt, had cattle on it forever. The gentleman sold 3 acres to an individual to build a house. Well, the seller ended up getting a notice that rollback taxes were due on that 3 acres, and it was sent to the seller. Seller was irate, saying, I'm not the one that changed use. The person that bought it did. No. The appraisal district said, look, whenever you carved off 3 acres, 3 acres will not qualify for an ag exemption. So by carving off that 3 acres, you're the one, seller, you're the one that decided to change the use. You will get that rollback. Seller was mad, saying they're not going to pay it, but yeah, they actually will. So if you're carving off smaller pieces, even though it's part of a huge ranch, be careful. Be careful. You may, by carving off something smaller than 5 acres, may very well trigger a rollback tax. Okay, I just went over this example. 170 acres has ag exemption. Seller carves off 3 acres, sells to buyer using the farm and ranch contract. Buyer's not going to qualify for the ag exemption on 3 acres. Selling 3 acres, appraisal district will say the seller's the one that changed the use. Farm and ranch contract says whoever changes the use is the one that pays the rollback. Paragraph 14, casualty loss. Sometimes things happen whenever we're under contract. We may have grass fires. We may have hail. We may have tornadoes. Paragraph 14 covers this. It says that seller shall restore the property to its previous condition as soon as reasonably possible. But in the event that the closing date occurs If seller fails to return it to its previous condition, buyer may terminate this contract. Now, I've seen a lot of times that you're under contract. Let's say you get a tornado, you get hail. Well, the insurance company will start working with the current owner, and the current owner needs to tell the insurance company, we're under contract to sell this. So before we can get the work done, we're going to have our closing date. Insurance oftentimes will continue to work with that buyer after closing, the same insurance company. Get in touch with your insurance company as soon as you see casualty loss if you're under contract. That ought to be, if not the first call that you make, first call to your real estate agent, second call to your insurance company. We'll just keep on rolling. We're at the last part of the contract, 15, 16, and 17. This is, of course, have your client or attorney look at this. It's about your default. It's about how you're going to mediate if there's an issue, and attorney's fees. Have your client or attorney read this. Make sure everybody's in agreement. Paragraph 18, exact same as the other contracts with escrow. 19 and 20. We're at the last two paragraphs of this contract. 19 has to do with your FERPTA. I'm sorry. 19 is all covenants and restrictions and warranties in this contract survive closing. 20A deals with FERPTA, which is if a foreign person sells property, then the buyer is required to withhold federal income tax from that seller and send it to the IRS. If the buyer doesn't, and there's a federal income tax liability associated with that seller, and buyer didn't do the withholding, buyer could be responsible for paying that federal income tax bill. This is one that's usually happened at closing. It's usually handled at closing. Your title company will ask the buyer about the withholding, and they'll take care of everything. Paragraph 20B, brand new paragraph. This is a CYA. I love the paragraph the most where, earlier in the contract, where it will change the sales price based on the acreage and how it looks with the survey versus the list. This paragraph I'm the most proud of. Back in 1978, the federal government passed a law, and it's called the Agricultural Foreign Investment Disclosure Act of 1978. This law states that if anyone is a non-U.S. citizen that purchases 10% ownership or more in ag property, they're required to fill out and file paperwork with the federal government, letting them know about that purchase within 90 days of purchase. If they don't fill out the paperwork within 90 days of purchase, they could be fined 25% of the market value of the property. I found this out about 8 years ago. I was going to be on an MLS meeting, and I was going to be on with the appraisal district. At the time, all I had to talk about, the only presentation I had for real estate agents was about the ag exemption. I'm going to be on with the appraisal district. I can't do my normal song and dance. So I started calling around to different government agencies and saying, if you had 5 minutes with a real estate agent, what would you want them to know? United States Department of Agriculture Farm Service Agency, FSA, said this right here. Okay, 25, they've got to file this paperwork within 90 days of purchase. If they don't, they can be fined 25% of the market value of the property. My question to the United States Department of Agriculture is, who's supposed to let people know? Know that they're supposed to do this. The local farm service agency didn't have any idea. We called the state level. They didn't have any idea. We called Washington, D.C. After being bounced around to several different offices, someone finally said, yes, I know what you're talking about. I said, okay, who's supposed to tell them? Who's supposed to give notice? United States Department of Agriculture's stance was real estate agents were trained on that when they got their license. They're responsible for telling their clients. I hit the ceiling. I said, no, real estate agents have never been told. But that was the federal government's stance. I found that out 8 years ago. I pushed for 8 years. 8 years I pushed and said, we need a paragraph in the contract that gives this notice. Let's take the onus and take the responsibility off of real estate agents who are trained on that. No, let's give them notice in the contract. The Trek Farm and Ranch contract this year has it in. That's a brand new paragraph. TR does not have it in their contract. If you happen to be using the TR, the Texas Realtors Farm and Ranch contract, I would strongly recommend giving buyers notice that this law is out there and you need to file with the federal government. I would keep a copy of you letting them know. If not, you're protected underneath the Trek Farm and Ranch contract. Paragraph 20B, 20A, again, that's for FERPTA. 20B, brand new. It deals with the Foreign Agricultural Investment Disclosure Act of 1978. Here is the Farm Service Agency 153. This is the form that actually is used to give notice if you're a non-U.S. citizen and you have to file paperwork underneath the Foreign Agricultural Foreign Investment Disclosure Act. This is what it looks like. Pretty simple. Fill in the blank. You send it back to the Farm Service Agency of your local office. 21, here's your notices. Not just a good idea to put the agent's information here. Your brokerage will be assuming the risk of receiving parties' notices. This is one that a couple of weeks ago I was over in an office and the brokerage said, we absolutely want only our information on here. We are the only ones. We will take that risk of making sure notices get to buyer, seller. We'll make sure. We don't want the buyer and seller information on here for them to be talking back and forth. We don't want that. This brokerage that I was dealing with just a couple of weeks ago said, we don't want the buyer and seller here. We don't want them getting the notices. We'll handle that. They took on the risk. Not a great idea. There is additional risk associated with that. But for them, that brokerage, they said, we're willing to take that on. Why do you send notices about the contract? Who do you send them to? The party or their agent? Well, this is intended to be a contract information for the buyer and seller, so at least their email address is there. At a minimum, include the buyer and seller email addresses as part of the notices. That's good practice. Again, you're taking on additional risk. You have to ask yourself if it's worth that risk. Make sure, paragraph 22, make sure everything that's checked is attached and everything that's attached is checked. Here is your addendum for 1031 exchange. Paragraph 23 says, make sure you consult an attorney before signing. Both the buyer and seller have been warned here, in other words. Fill out the effective date. Make sure you fill it out every single time. Effective date should be filled in before the contract's delivered to the title company. Remember, the effective date is the last step of the final acceptance. Both parties have unequivocally accepted all terms of the transaction. Both parties have signed, and the last party to sign has notified and communicated with the other side that we have a deal. Here's your ratification fee, your broker agreement. This is the agreement to use if there's no listing agreement with your clients. There's your receipts, your option fee, earnest money, contract receipt, additional earnest money receipt. And I'll be happy to answer any type of questions y'all may have. This is my contact info. I believe we got this done in record time. So I hope that you don't mind that, Lisa.
I don't at all, and I don't think anybody else does either. We sure appreciate your time and taking information that can be like Charlie Brown's teacher and making it interactive and real world scenarios. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Bennett while he's on the line? Anyone?
No questions, but thank you.
Yep, they're all asleep. I apologize for that,
No.
but you know
No,
what?
agreeable. Thank you very much.
Lisa, if you can get me those names and license numbers, I will get that all entered, and y'all will be getting your contracts credit as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Bennett. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so
Sounds
much.
good. Thank y'all so much.
Thank
Yes, sir. Alrighty, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you, sir.